My guest today on Felony Friday is Ken Good. Ken graduated from Hardin-Simmons University in 1982 with a Bachelor of Arts degree. He received his Master of Education degree in 1986 from Tarleton State University. And in 1998, he received his law degree from Texas Tech School of Law, where he was a member of the Texas Tech Law Review. Mr. Good has argued cases before the Supreme Court of Texas, Texas Courts of Criminal Appeals, along with numerous court appeals, including the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. He's the author of Goods on Bail, a practice guide created for bail industry professionals. In addition, he has written numerous articles on the subject of bail reform, including what a successful bail reform looks like. He's worked closely with lawmakers and law enforcement on bail matters and will be providing input on key decisions or for key decision makers as new policies are developed moving forward. Mr. Good offers his perspective on those in charge of public safety, what they should consider before making these decisions affecting not only the persons charged with the crime, but of course, society as a whole. Ken, welcome to Felony Friday.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on Felony Friday. That's a very interesting title. I love that.
Yeah, it's, the title just kind of created itself, as happens with podcasts. But this is a show, of course, focused on criminal justice reform. And I've asked you to come on to speak specifically to bail reform and how coronavirus has impacted that with the jails being cleared out. And we'll talk about all that stuff, and we'll dig into all the different nuances and how public safety is impacted, and violent versus nonviolent offenders, how you see that playing out in the future with regards to bail and people being held in jails. But before we go down that road, so my audience can get to know you a little better and your background, if you could start off by sharing, first of all, what got you interested in the criminal justice system, in the legal field, and going to law school and going down this road?
Well, honestly, my parents were both public school teachers, and they taught us the importance of an education. And my mom and dad were always encouragers. My mom and I used to stay up on Sunday nights. You would watch the news, and then at that time, from 10:30 to 10:35, they would have the sports extra. And then from 10:35 until 11:35, they would show an episode of Perry Mason. So my mom and I, for several years, would be the only ones in our house up from 10:35 to 11:35 on Sunday nights, which would be a school night, and we would watch Perry Mason. And so I always dreamed of being an attorney, but it was always a dream. It was never a goal, because when you're young and stupid, you don't really know the difference between the two. And then I discovered, you can reach your dreams, but you have to set goals. You have to work towards them. Being from a real small town, a farming town, there's only 24 people in my class. 4 of us went to college. And then, I decided I wanted to go to law school, but I worked all the time. I graduated in 3 years, so I had to get a master's degree so I could go to law school. Went to law school, did very well. Went to work for a large law firm in Dallas that had a satellite office in Tyler, and I went to Tyler and learned to practice law with one of the best trial attorneys in the state at the time. In my opinion, we had a very good trial team. We represented doctors and hospitals when they got sued. We were on court TV. I got interested in doing appellate law. I argued a lot of cases for that office, argued cases before the Supreme Court of Texas and the Court of Criminal Appeals very early in my career. And that's just really continued on. There was a bondsman who had 45 default judgments, and he asked somebody, who do you hire to try to set aside default judgment? And they said, well, you need an appellate attorney. And so they called and hired me. And as a result of that, the word of mouth, my practice grew, and I now represent a lot of bondsmen in the state of Texas and several insurance companies statewide. And I found that this industry has similar values and to the small town where I grew up, and we just kind of hit it off. I'm on the board of their state organization. I'm on their legislative team, and we go to the legislature to address bail issues. We present bills for the legislature to carry. We give insight on proposed bills. And it's been a very good adventure. And I've made a lot of friends in the industry of these mom and pop small businesses across the state.
So you mentioned shared values between the town you grew up in the bail industry. What would be some of those shared values?
I think, if you think, I'm a very much a Mayberry RFD kind of guy. I mean, the right and wrong. But I would say it differently also. I'd say, there was a time in this country where we all had a shared set of values of what pulled us together. Mm-hmm. And I think that is still true for, the small towns and also the bonding community. I think that's what we share still. They're very law enforcement oriented. They're also pro small businesses and, anti-regulations. And so these are a lot of times I think they're just small town, pro business, pro law and order, and probably, somewhat conservative people.
Yeah, it's interesting. And especially now with coronavirus and with a lot of people being released from jails across the country. And I want to ask you, I guess, first with being in Texas, and I don't think Texas has had as much of a coronavirus impact as a lot of other states, especially in the Northeast. I'm up in Pennsylvania, so I think so. Maybe I'm wrong. I think we've had more of an impact. I'm not sure if it's been equal impacts to people being released from jails, but what sort of changes have you seen in Texas regarding bail, and have a lot of people been released? Are the jails empty? What are you seeing down there?
Well, we do have one hot spot, and that is Harris County in Houston. It's been a hot spot of the coronavirus, and it's also been a hot spot for fighting over what to do with people in the jail. Harris County had some litigation resolving on that issue, and they did a settlement which was very left of center in its intention. And since it was a settlement, it went further than anything the court could ever order them to do. And so when it came time, or when the coronavirus first arose, they filed a motion in that litigation to order the county to release half the people in the jail. And the jail carries 8,000 people. The county didn't even oppose the motion. And so the governor and the attorney general intervened and said, since they won't defend Texas law, allow us to intervene to do so. And so even though the county did not even oppose it, the governor and the attorney general stepped in and opposed it, and the motion was denied. We've seen a lot of release. I mean, I like to call this period, we're seeing bail reform on steroids. We're seeing, what would be the impact on society and on our legal system if we tried these things that our friends on the other side keep saying we should be doing. And so the coronavirus has given us a fast forward look into the future of what would happen if we did these things. And it's not been a pretty picture.
So when you say it's not been a pretty picture, are you seeing the people who have been released from jails? Or are they committing crimes, or what types of things are you seeing?
Well, we are seeing a lot of, there's some articles saying that 25% of them are committing more crimes. What we're seeing is, I would describe it as, are we trying criminal justice reform, or are we just doing surrender of criminal justice reform? I mean, we can't just take away all accountability and call that reform, which is what we're seeing. You get arrested and then you get released, and then you get arrested again in a couple of days and you get released, and then you get arrested again. I mean, we started keeping track. I mean, we have a blog, and we started keeping track. We started keeping records. So the first record was somebody was arrested or committed a new crime within 37 minutes of being released. And then we had a new record when someone was committing a new crime within 10 minutes of being released. And you would say it's funny, but it's not, because on the 10 minutes, it's in the parking lot of the jail. The guy's demanding keys to carjack a car. And when the mother says no, he starts strangling her 10 or 11-year-old child. until she turns over the keys.
So these are violent crimes.
Well,
I mean,
these are career criminals. I mean, career criminals get arrested for minor things as well. I mean, we've got one guy who's, got over a dozen arrests or charges in the last year. When the problem we're doing is we're making mass decisions without any accountability. So someone that's got a lot of arrests in their past gets arrested on a minor charge, and we don't care. We don't care about their past. We don't care about public safety. We just release them. And so we've removed all accountability from the decision making of whether to release them. And then if they get released and are rearrested, we don't even apply accountability at that point. And the sad thing is that is the reforms that our friends are asking us to adopt and apply in the future.
But when you say the reforms that your friends are asking, are you talking about people on the left? And
yes.
Are you referring to, because like when it comes to me with bail reform, I look at it as almost, it's probably more than two categories, but just for the purpose of talking about it, starting the conversation, lumping into violent and non-violent criminals. I'm much more inclined, especially with the coronavirus pandemic, to allow those who've committed non-violent crimes, drug offenses, fraud, things like that, to get out of jail and not be stuck waiting in a prison. Someone who has committed rape or, something like that, I would be much more inclined to keep them in jail, even during a coronavirus pandemic.
Well, I would add a layer onto that. We should be looking at their criminal histories. And, someone who doesn't have a criminal history or has something distant in the past, and we want to give them a shot because they say, well, we can't afford the bond. We can't afford what the bail you set it at. And so they don't have a criminal history or they don't have a substantial criminal history. I think that's one category. The problem that we have, and to directly address your issue, is even on the people who don't have a nonviolent crimes, is how are we going to get them to court when this godforsaken pandemic is finally over with? I mean, we're going to have huge backlogs of cases. And the studies show, and just the real life experiences in Harris County show, that you have a 400% better chance of someone showing up for court if they're on a surety bond. I mean, that has a real impact on them and on their case. I mean, they start learning, hey, we can miss and there's no accountability. So
can you explain? Can you quickly explain how that works with the surety bond, if somebody doesn't show up for a court date?
Yes. Well, I mean, you're arrested, the court sets bail. Now, in Texas, you can post cash, you can post a surety bond, or you can request a PR bond, which is a release upon your promise that you will come back. There's no surety. And so you post a bond, and then you get notification, you have a court date. Your bond is saying you're getting released from jail, and you will go to court anytime requested on any notice. It's called instanter in Texas. And so you're requested to go for a hearing. You're required in Texas, except in Harris County under the settlement, that you have to go to court anytime there's a hearing. If you don't show up, then your bond is forfeited. That every time the bond is forfeited or every time you don't show up for court, there does great damage to the criminal justice system because we have to give 3 days notice of a hearing. And then if you don't show up, the case has to be put on hold. We can't do the hearing without you. And so your case is put on hold until you come back. Now, if you've got a surety bond, we're calling to remind you to go to court. We're sending you texts to go to court. And if you don't show up for court, we're going to call you within a very short period of time, or we're going to start trying to locate you to say, hey, and what we give to the system is the assurance. These people know us. They trust us when we say, hey, you screwed up. Your case will most likely if you get back within a few days, we can get your case back on track. You'll get a new hearing, and that'll be the end of it. But people who don't have a surety bond, they get scared. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know the system, or they don't trust the system, and so they are hiding. And a lot of times, sometimes they come back on their own, but a lot of times they come back because they commit a new crime, and their case is on hold until they come back. under Texas, we can file new charges against them for failing to appear. Each time you miss court, it could be a new criminal charge. But most counties in the state don't do that. They don't file charges for you failing to appear. We just don't have time.
So what do you envision coming out of this coronavirus pandemic, and they start to reschedule these court cases? What do you think is going to happen?
I think we're going to have we're going to have chaos, first of all. And in these jurisdictions where they just release people, first of all, you're going to set hearings, and I would say at least 50%. That's what the stats out of Harris County say. So it'll be higher because of just the chaos. And defendants, as time goes by, defendants are nomads. So if they've moved, then the courts haven't been updated on where they're living, where to send the notice. So it's going to be mass chaos on getting people to show up for court. And if I was, there's an article on our blog that we just posted or reposted a story about a judge who, she just did something in her courtroom so I'm just going to try PR bonds for a while. And for every 8 weeks of just PR bonds, she created a whole new week's worth of work for herself. And so I think the lesson is when you start getting courts and start getting people back, I would get them in and I would set a bond and say, can you afford a surety bond? If you can, you need to get one because that's your best way to get people back to court. And if they can't, then give them a trial of coming back. But if they miss court and then they come back and then you have to get them back through an arrest, I mean, at some point, if you're just not going to have any accountability, then they know they control the system. You only have criminal justice through a voluntary process of people agreeing to show up. So at some point, you're going to have to say, you didn't show up 4 times, so you don't get another PR bond. And if you can't do a surety bond, you just sit in jail. If we don't do that, then these cases will never get resolved because they'll learn very quickly that there's no consequences if they don't show up. And so they control the system instead of we do.
So when you say there's no consequences if they don't show up, I mean, does that differ based on the level of the crime?
Well, that's a very interesting question because we're starting to see jurisdictions play games with the category of the crime. Look in California, they downgrade a bunch of felonies and made them misdemeanors, and now they're saying, "Oh, we've had a lot less felony crime." And then you see where they'll say, "Well, we're only doing this with non-dangerous crimes. We're only doing this with low-level crimes." And the problem is, it never stops there because we've been having criminal justice reform for a while. We don't hold those people in the jails now. I mean, if you looked in Harris County for the 8,000 people in jail, there's less than 3% that are misdemeanors. And that was in the federal case that was just where they looked at it. And the 3% that are misdemeanors are not just sitting there. That's the group that are getting arrested, released, arrested, released, arrested, released as they're cycling through the jail. And so we already have gone past those points. You see all these statistics saying, this harms a family for them to be away and not at work. Those people aren't in jail anymore. We're talking about people who have criminal histories. They're just laughing at us. There's the situation from New York where a guy was arrested 130-something times. At one point, it's much more now. And he was laughing and saying, "Thanks, Democrats, for bail reform. It's lit." And that was before New York rolled back their bail reform, even during the pandemic, because it was just such a fiasco.
So, speaking of bail reform, I mean, there has been a national movement prior to coronavirus and all this for bail reform, and something that I am not familiar with, but there's a risk assessment, a use of a risk assessment in order to, I guess, facilitate bail. In order to maybe you can explain to me how these risk assessments are used to determine. Is it to determine if someone gets bail or not, or what are these risk assessments they're using?
Well, risk assessment can be used in 2 ways. It can be, meant to take the place of the surety bondsman, or it can just be additional information. I think New Jersey is the example, and maybe, New York is, California's having a repeal election in November, but their reform was based upon kind of the New Jersey model. And under the New Jersey model, you have a constitutional amendment. You can, if someone is considered a risk under the risk assessment tool, then you can just detain them. And if they're low risk, you just release them. And then anything in between, the judge has certain discretions on what he could do. The problem with the risk assessments is, our friends, and when I say our friends, I'm talking about the people on the left side advocating for a lot of these reforms. They came out with these probably 5 or 6, maybe 7 years ago. It's something they developed as the panacea,
I think.
Yeah, panacea to replace bondsmen. It was the thing that was going to fix the system. And the problem with that was they didn't really do a lot of studies on it or peer-reviewed research. That's now been done, and they have all come to the same conclusion that risk assessments should not be used as a part of bail criminal justice reform. A group of the largest digital companies in the world came together and did a joint statement saying that they were rushed, they were not properly researched. They are pretty accurate on addressing what group behavior is, but they're terrible on addressing what an individual might do.
Yeah.
And as a result, since their prediction is based on what a group does, they use group dynamics, group profiles, and so there's a large racial component. And so they've been rejected. All the groups on the left, I think, but maybe one that were advocating for the use of risk assessments have now changed their mind and now say they were wrong. And even, the Vera Institute, which supported their use in New Jersey, now says they consider New Jersey an example of failed bail reform. And that goes to the very cornerstone of what bail reform should look like, because that was what they were proposing. The Vera Institute changed course February, the month before the pandemic. And so what are they offering now? And you can see in the coronavirus what their proposal is now. We just release everybody. And that's what they've been doing in Houston for the last year for misdemeanors, low-level crimes, as you might call them. And it has just been a fiasco. New York tried that since January 1. Just release quote-unquote low-level risk people. And it was so much of a fiasco that during the middle of the pandemic, the New York legislature rolled back many of those reforms. Just releasing people from jail, even if we call it low-level, without taking anything else into consideration and not giving discretion or direction to the trial courts leads to chaos. And I think that's been pretty conclusively shown. But our friends still advocate that the bail reform of the future is just to release people.
The risk assessment is interesting to me because I do risk analysis on, projects like infrastructure projects, things of that nature for a living. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I could I could track with you. I was nodding my head as we were talking there about it because it makes total sense to me. Obviously, it's going to go towards these, taking data from these, large demographics and making decisions based on individuals using this data when individuals are going to act, very, very differently in many cases. You can't predict an individual's behavior. You can't predict human action. There's so many different factors that go into it.
Well, if you look at me, I'm a great example. I grew up in a small town, 24 people in my high school class, only 4 went to college. A risk assessment on that would say I had 0 chance of going to college, or I had a 25% chance of going to college. I had a 0% chance of going to graduate school. I had a 0% chance of going to law school or doing, so what are the chances, according to some kind of risk assessment, of me arguing a case at the Supreme Court of Texas or winning a case or arguing and winning 2 cases at the Court of Criminal Appeals? The risk assessment would have said 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and it would have been wrong every time on me. Because you can't, the intangibles on an individual cannot be predicted by a risk assessment.
Yeah, and another interesting aspect, and I don't want to make this a left-right thing, but I think it's out there, so I'm going to say it. But you would think people from the left would see the threat of this being potentially this risk assessment on individuals invading civil liberties and privacy concerns. Because, I mean, you could get to the point where you're looking at an individual's social media behavior, their posts, what are they saying online, and looking at different actions in their personal life to eventually come into that risk assessment.
Well, and I think that's what they've done because, when they, like in New Jersey, when they say the risk assessment is now we consider a failure, they don't consider it a failure because of the way it impacted the jail population. It's because the way they impacted the percentages of the jail population. The percentages of the racial groups in the jail in New Jersey are the same after the reforms as they were before the reforms. And that's why they consider it a failure, because they want it to be a more equitable system. And since the racial makeup is the same, they consider it now fail. So that's their goal. And they remove all accountability, and they don't want accountability to be a part. One of the big fights on the risk assessments was, we're predicting their risk of committing another crime, but we don't want to take into consideration how many times they've been arrested. Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like that would be something important to take into consideration if we're going to determine their risk of whether they're going to commit another crime while they're released. And they didn't want to do that.
So when it comes to implementing some of these bail reform measures and, these changes that really do have an impact on public safety, who ultimately makes, when you talk about like when you get down to the local level, are they making these decisions on a county level? Is it district attorneys who make these who's making these decisions?
I think it depends on where you're at. The people who have a say in criminal justice, the sheriff is over the jail. The judges, misdemeanor judges would be county court judges in Texas. Felony judges would be district court judges in Texas. You have the county commissioners because they have to pay for it. And then that's the local level. But for the state to have changes like, I would say the focus in Texas on bail reform would be at the Texas legislature, which meets every 2 years. But since the legislature is not doing what our friends on the other side want, they're trying to pick us off or pick off the state one county at a time. So they sued Harris County. They're threatening to sue Bexar County. They sued Dallas County. They sued Galveston County. And so it's kind of they're making demands saying our way or the highway. And, it's kind of like, I keep saying, are we going to do reform or are we going to just surrender? Because it's kind of like they're saying, do it our way or we're going to sue you. And I think the governor and the attorney general have shown if you just stand up to these people, you will win. But the problem is the counties don't want to spend a bunch of money. I mean, Harris County spent $8 million defending the case. They were winning, but then there was an election and all the judges were changed on their party affiliation with new judges who promised to settle. And so now they've settled with a left proposal and have agreed to spend $100 million as a down payment. I mean, it would have been much better to spend another $8 million to win the case than what they're doing. They've agreed to do such silly things as they're going to do a study. And if the study says, well, people don't show up for court because they don't have a ride, well, the county's agreed to start giving them free rides, free telephones, free daycare. I mean, that's when I start saying we've removed accountability. It's nobody's fault. We're just surrendering.
Well, at that point, I mean, we talk about public safety issues with regards to this. Then it becomes a public financial issue. All the tax dollars being drained into that.
Well, and you're going to see more of that as the impact of the COVID-19 comes more to light. I mean, look in California, they've voted for a criminal justice reform that essentially gets rid of the private surety bail and adopts a New Jersey model. It's now on hold waiting for an election. And the problem is during the period between when they enacted it and the election, all this stuff came out and now says risk assessment shouldn't be used. No one says they should. No study says they should. All the studies consistently say you should not. And we have on top of that a $54 billion shortfall in California and they hadn't even funded these reforms. And so we're going to have that across the state. I mean, but our friends on the other side are hoping to use that as well. They're wanting to go to these counties and these states and say, look how much money you saved from people in the jail during the COVID-19 crisis by just releasing people. You should continue those policies. And we're like, I'm like, we could find common ground. There's common ground between the two sides, but the common ground has to be based upon adding accountability. They can't add accountability because we've already released the first-time offenders years ago in reform. If we add accountability and looking at their criminal histories, well, then the reforms that they're seeking for really can't be done because we're in the process of having a criminal justice crisis with public safety because of the proposals they've made have taken accountability out of the system. And accountability has to be put back in. The reforms that they're suggesting, what's going on in Harris County, cannot continue. It will, the backlogs of cases before the crisis of the virus had already jumped 100% in a year. They can't do that every year. They're already going to jump another 100% because of the virus. That will cause the criminal justice system to shut down. And so it can't continue. So the changes that they've made in Harris County will not continue very long because the public won't stand for them. And I think the COVID-19 has just put it all on steroids and put it on display. And it's been very ugly.
So with regards to the backlog in cases, like roughly, and maybe you don't know this because we're just coming into this period, but when the courts are ramping back up, how long are people going to be waiting for their court date?
Oh, we have no idea. What they're doing in Harris County already, because we've seen some articles about it, is they're discounting punishments to give criminals and defendants incentive to plead guilty. So they'll give out deferred adjudication like candy. Deferred adjudication says you plead guilty, you're on deferred probation, which means if you don't commit another crime during a period of time, then the first case is dismissed and it's not even on your record. We're giving those out for people with guns, people, shooting people, but they didn't die. And the problem with that is we've had a couple of examples where there was a violation and they're just so busy. They don't have time and they don't file a motion to revoke their probation or to adjudicate their guilt. And then their probation ends. Well, then they end up killing somebody. That's one of the examples that's been in the news. And so here's somebody who would have been in prison if they had done their job, but because they're giving out these things like candy, they can't monitor them. Public safety has taken a severe hit. And there's a death that would not have happened if the criminal justice system wasn't in chaos.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to, in the United States, by far, we have the most incarcerated individuals. You look at every level, locally, state, federal, in the entire world. And, especially with what's going on in the country right now, there's so much division around the criminal justice system, policing. And the one thing that I come back to is just, maybe we have too many laws and we're not focusing on the right areas. We're not focusing our energy, our policing on the most violent crimes. We're distracted in nonviolent areas. And not only is that, have an impact in the lives of those individuals, a negative impact, but it's allowing the violent individuals to skate by. And a lot of the times our prisons are overcrowded because we're bringing in all these nonviolent offenders and there's not enough room. So they're letting some of these violent offenders walk earlier.
I agree. We're not doing any analysis of an individual. We're doing group decisions. So we have to let a group of people out of jail instead of looking at a case-by-case basis. Has he shown that he has the capability, or has she shown that she has changed her ways? We're not seeing that. And I think we would have a lot of middle ground with our friends on the left about just doing a top-down review of what we have as crimes. Because I agree with you, that's a problem because it's masking the bigger issue. But the other problem is you don't go to jail on a first offense anymore. you're now, it's getting to the point now where you don't go to jail on multiple offenses. I mean, we had somebody that was killed a month or so ago. It was, during the COVID crisis in Houston. And the person who killed this 80-year-old grandma who was in a parking lot at Walgreens had been arrested over 30-something times. He'd been charged over 30-something times. He was out on 2 felony PR bonds at the time. I mean, so when I say we're taking accountability out of the system, we don't have the time to give out that, let's look at your case, let's see what your situation is. And I think our friends do not realize that the situation they're creating by making group decisions is we don't have time. The magistrates, the judges don't have time to devote to each individual case to determine where they are. And I think that is a grave mistake of our friends, and I think it will have a big backlash on them. And we should be looking for ways to divert people who can pay for their own supervision out of the jail as quickly as possible. Because the problem is, how do you process large groups of people through the jail quickly and efficiently? And under their reforms, you do it by just releasing everybody, which causes a public safety issue. A better way, which historically has been done, is to have a bail schedule. The people that can afford to pay for their own supervision with the private system, private surety system, post their bond, they get processed through the jail quickly. And then the courts, the magistrates, can focus their limited time on who's left to determine what's your situation, how do we get you back on track, and the system our friends are advocating for removes all that, and you don't have time, so you got to make group decisions, and that's what's killing us right now.
That makes sense. So, Ken, I want to thank you, first of all, for your time, and very, very educational, and I've learned a lot just from talking with you today. But before I let you go, I just want to give you some time to plug, anywhere you want to direct people to, a website or any of your content.
Well, thank you very much. For anyone who would like to have additional information about our situation in Texas and bail reform in general, you can go to the website for the Professional Bondsmen of Texas, pbtx.com. You can go to our blog as well, and you can see us on our Facebook and on Twitter, and there's links to all those on the website.
All right, Ken. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed talking to you. It was a great conversation.